If you have great insurance tools, go back to that slide. If you have great ways to deal with risk, then you don't care about that trade-off so much. You're going to go for the choice that maximizes profitability. But if you have weak ways to deal with risk, then you might choose something down here where there's less profit but also less risk. Poor households who have fewer ways to deal with risk are likely to be down here. Richer families that already have a cushion, they've got more savings, more assets, they can be here. And so this is a way in which poverty can perpetuate itself. And I want to show you just some data. We don't have great data on this. One result from South India was that when we think about the monsoon, for poor farmers in South India, monsoon is the big source of variability. When does that monsoon come? When does the monsoon come and bring water and nourishment to the fields and sort of set into place the harvest cycle? If the monsoon is unpredictable when it's going to come, that's going to make farm households reluctant to invest heavily in their crops. If it's more predictable, they're going to be more comfortable investing. So what we see here is that the poorest quartile, the bottom 25%, make choices, this is a kind of hypothetical example, make choices that reduce their profitability in crops by 35% when the timing of the monsoon becomes more unpredictable, right? Technically, an increase in the coefficient of variation of the date of the start of the monsoon. As that date becomes more unpredictable, we see that for the bottom 25%, they have a sharp reduction in profit because they're not willing to invest so much. At the median, a 15% reduction in profit. For the wealthiest, almost no effect. They've got ways to cushion this, so they're not making that trade-off. That's the way that we see households are pushed into poverty, and poverty reinforces itself. Those are the ways in which vulnerability can exacerbate poverty. Reduces mean income through these kind of strategic choices that reduce profitability. When bad things happen, forces asset depletion, which is very costly, and also, in itself, being in a situation with a lot of risk is welfare reducing, right? It's just a lot of stress in itself. I want to take a few minutes to talk about Shika and Dinesh. They're in Portfolios of the Poor. There are actually a couple of stories in chapter 3 that I think you'll find compelling. Shika and Dinesh are an interesting story because they're typical in the sense of facing a series of health problems. They started when Dinesh, the husband, they're in the city, in the Delhi sample. 1995, they came to Delhi destitute. Dinesh got sick, and they started doing what a lot of families do. In desperation, they start selling off their land. That all disappeared. And then they took on debts. It equaled $212 in the end, which is a lot for a family like this. And they're paying interest on that debt at 5% a month, which is a lot for a family that's suffering such problems. Shika, the mother in the family, the wife, working in the field with her son, tried to deal with the debts. Very, very difficult. The good news is that Dinesh was then, his problems were overcome. He had a job, and then the son contracted tuberculosis. And you can see the story in the book, but in that process they took on even more debts, and the debts totaled $1,270. $106 of it, 3 years later, was still outstanding. So the couple dealt with a health crisis, but we saw that those crises were financial crises as well. This division between health crises and financial crises is less clear. Solving a health crisis means solving a financial crisis. And so we're going to talk about financial tools, which are often the key to solving health problems. And this is a story which really makes that clear. how could insurance have helped? It could have given them the money they needed when they needed it, and also not left this kind of legacy of debt that hung over their head for years afterward. Third topic, patching. Really briefly, because this is something we've been talking about in terms of portfolios of the poor. Hamid and Khadija, we met from chapter 1, we've seen them before. And what I just want to go back to here is they have an insurance policy, a life insurance policy that Khadija took to support, or in the event that Hamid lost his life, it's also a saving vehicle. We also see a lot of other things they're doing. A lot of that is savings devices. They're borrowing. They're doing a lot. All of these mechanisms are sort of patched together to create their financial lives. Some of it's to accumulate savings. Some of it's to deal with risk. And these are the savings ones. So when we talk about insurance, we're talking about adding an instrument to this array of devices that are already in hand. Some of those devices, this is from Bangladesh, India, and South Africa. Some of those devices, as we saw, I'm going to go back here, interest-free loan from neighbor. Some of these devices are interest-free loans. That's a very common way that families deal with risk. They give money to others, they lend it, but they say, look, don't worry about the interest, and often it'll be reciprocal, so at a later date, if the other family is in trouble, they'll also get a loan. These are pretty big. In Bangladesh, almost 7 over the year on average were borrowed, 5 almost in India, 3 in South Africa. Small amounts generally, but very useful. Another story in Portfolios of the Poor has to do with a funeral. And this is another great example of patching. This is an example of Tembi's brother. Now Tembi is a woman that Daryl Collins got to know, and her brother died, and Tembi was responsible for the funeral. This was an expensive funeral, and we can have lots of conversations about whether a funeral that costs $1,400 is the right way to spend money in a community where resources are so scarce. We see other big expenses like this in other countries. In India, huge weddings, small funerals. Other places, ceremonies are a major, major expense item. I'm not going to pass judgment. Our conversation here is, given the expense of a funeral, how do you deal with it? It's a great example of patching. Here are the costs. The funerals are expensive because the whole family and community is brought together. They're fed with food. There's a meal of sheep. A tent is put up. The undertaker provides part of the ceremony and coffins, etc. And this is how it was done. There was a burial society, a formal organization in the community that's purpose-built to help deal with funeral expenses. But does it pay for all $1,400? No. It's actually only about 10%. The other big parts were relatives contributing. A series of relatives, one helped rent the tent, one helped rent the cooking pots, another purchased the sheep. We also saw borrowing, sometimes at expensive rates. Some at no interest, some at expensive rates, and then grant money as well. So what we're really talking about when we talk about insurance and dealing with risk is devices that can help patch together with a whole bunch of other things, could help create a more effective whole. And that's the key to the story. Thinking about loans, the broad portfolio, partial solutions are helpful. Better partial solutions. So we've talked about income, we've talked about some of the ways that risk is connected to poverty, we've talked about patching. Now we're going to talk about risk and informal insurance very, very briefly, because I want to get to some of the solutions which are emerging with microinsurance. So, risks and informal insurance. One of the things we see is that, all risk is not the same. Some are easier to deal with, some are harder to deal with. Some can be dealt with through saving and borrowing. So the two elements. Some risks are tricky because they are spatially covariate. They affect a lot of people at the same time. Some are tricky because they're temporally covariate, temporally correlated. They happen again and again, and you've exhausted your coping mechanisms. Maybe you could deal with the first year, but the second or third year is hard. And the third element is that they're catastrophic. They're just large. So those are on top of everything else. Even if they're not spatially covariate or temporally correlated over time, they're just big and hard to handle. And so those are the dimensions we're concerned about. The solutions we're also concerned about: reliability, speed, convenience. All that matters a lot. Speed in particular. You could have some solution, but if it's not going to get to you, it's not going to deliver resources for a month or two, that may be a month or two too late. And so we talk about transient shocks, ups and downs. That's different from a chronic shock. This is the hard one, where you have a drop and it's sustained. Common shocks, those are the hard ones where everybody suffers at the same time. Much easier in a situation like this, where you have idiosyncratic shocks, different things happening to different people at different times. And so that's the story. I'll skip over that and get to a little bit of data. Because of these issues, because insurance and risks are often hard to deal with, the informal sector actually isn't that great at providing resources in the most desperate times, when you really need the resources. And so, when there's droughts in South India, these sort of informal transfers between families helping each other out only covered about 10% of the income shortfalls. Not a lot of help. Some help, not a lot. Still left households very exposed. In the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, during periods of drought, transfers to poor households only accounting for 3% of the loss. Very small help, and that's not because people weren't generous, but because it was a big event, it affected lots of people at the same time. It was very difficult to help your neighbors when you yourself were suffering. Burkina Faso, similarly, this is in the 80s, little evidence of transfers after a drought. We just see this in other examples. The long-term acute illnesses, really hard to get support for, whereas so more common ups and downs, it's easier. So here's where I want to get to, which is microinsurance. Microinsurance is an idea that mirrors microfinance, microcredit, microsavings. Can you provide insurance products that are responsive, that are reliable, that work for poor households, that can be delivered, but that are also reasonably priced and small scale? So the potential is big. I want to give it a sense of that, because risk, if we think of it this way, and these are just a stylized drawing, if we think about risk, there's a lot of risk out there. Clearly microinsurance must be helpful. But then when we think about it, not all of that risk is insurable. There's some overlap, but a bunch of it, losing your job or having a political disruption, that's not insurable. So there's a part that's insurable. And then there's a question about, well, can insurance be delivered feasibly? That's a smaller group. And then, if it can be delivered feasibly, are people actually going to buy it? Which is a big issue. Often, you have an insurance product and take-up rates are pretty low. That red area is really what we're focused on. Hopefully, those are important issues for families, and that even addressing a small part of the overall risk is meaningful in the communities in which those problems happen. The issue, when we think about that, is having to rethink. Because insurance in richer countries tends to be a very customized product. Different families get different products, different contracts, different prices. Here, to make the economics work, we need to be much, much, much more standardized. So you need to think of that as a very, very clear, rule-bound product, which is fairly uniform in its delivery. So that's the hope. Let's move through this, and I want to make one point about affordability, because that's always the issue. Sure, you can design a product, but are people going to buy it? Well, frankly,